In September 4th, 1944, deep in the war-torn skies over Germany, a young farm boy from Kansas faced certain death inside the glass bubble of his B-17 bomber until a German fighter pilot locked eyes with him, raised a solemn salute, and chose not to fire. That single act of mercy would ripple across generations, linking two enemies through time and proving that even in humanity's darkest hour, compassion can still pierce the clouds of war. The sky over Kansas was wide and endless, a blue ocean that seemed to stretch forever. For most boys, it was just the ceiling of their world. But for Eli Turner, it was something more, a promise. Every day after his chores on the family farm, he'd climb up onto the windmill tower, squint at the distant clouds and dream of what it might feel like to be among them. He was 17 when the war began, 19 when he left the wheat fields behind. His mother cried quietly at the kitchen table while his father pretended to check the oil on the old Ford. Eli remembered the smell of the barn that morning, hay, dust, and gasoline, and how he'd promised he'd be back before the harvest. He didn't come back for 4 years. Now, in 1944, he was Staff Sergeant Eli Turner, ball turret gunner, 8th Air Force, stationed in England. The windmill was gone, replaced by the roaring engines of a B-17 Flying Fortress, Heaven's Door painted in white across the nose. His world had shrunk to the small glass sphere that hung beneath the belly of the bomber, a tight, cold bubble where death could come from any direction. They said the ball turret was for small men, and Eli fit the part. Lean, wiry, not even 5'7". He'd slide down into the bubble before each mission, fold himself around the twin 50 caliber machine guns, and lock in. The hatch would close above him, and suddenly he wasn't in a plane anymore. He was floating in space, the world upside down, clouds rushing beneath him, the rest of the crew, just voices over the intercom. That morning's target was Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany. Ball-bearing factories, crucial to the Nazi war machine. The briefing officer had called it strategic. The veterans called it a death run. 6 hours in, 6 out, the pilot, Captain Riley, said as they taxied down the runway. Keep your heads low and your prayers high. At 22,000 feet, frost bloomed on the inside of Eli's glass. Below, Germany rolled out like a grey sheet. Flak bursts, black puffs, began to bloom around them. The fortress shuddered. He could hear the sharp clatter of guns above, the dull thump of shells exploding nearby. "Bandits! 3 o'clock high!" someone shouted. Eli swiveled the turret, scanning. A streak of silver and black tore across the horizon. Messerschmitt, Bf 109s. They came in fast, sun glinting off their wings. Eli squeezed his triggers. The twin guns rattled, tracers arcing through the sky. One fighter peeled away, smoke trailing. Another came in low. Eli tracked him. Then the guns jammed. A hollow click, then silence. "Ball turret jammed! I'm out!" he shouted into the intercom. No answer, just static. The German fighter swung around, head on. Eli could see the yellow nose, the spinning propeller, and behind the canopy, a man, not a blur, not a monster. A man, young, maybe his age. Eli struggled with the handles, trying to clear the jam. The shell casings rattled around his feet. The fighter lined up for the shot. Eli's breath fogged the glass. He could see the muzzle flash about to bloom. But it didn't. The Messerschmitt slowed. It came close enough that Eli could see the pilot's eyes. Grey, sharp, steady. For a moment, the two men stared at each other through the glass, suspended between life and death. Then the German raised 2 fingers to his temple, a small salute, and rolled away. Eli twisted in disbelief. The fighter climbed into the clouds and vanished. A second later, the flak came back, exploding all around. When Heaven's Door finally limped back across the channel, she was missing 2 engines and half her tail. The crew stumbled out in silence. The ground crew counted the holes in the fuselage, 112. That night, Eli sat alone behind the barracks, his hands still trembling. The smell of gunpowder clung to him. He kept seeing the pilot's face, calm, almost gentle. The salute, the choice. Why? He whispered to himself. He thought about it for weeks, then years. After the war, when he finally went home to Kansas, the fields were still there, the same wide sky, the same windmill. But he was different. He'd wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, remembering that face in the clouds. Neighbors called him quiet. He married a schoolteacher, raised 2 kids, worked the farm. But he never spoke of that mission, not once. Sometimes, on long summer afternoons, he'd stand out by the wheat and watch the contrails of jets high above, white streaks across the blue. He'd think about how small the world had felt in that turret, how close life and death could come. He'd read stories in the paper about captured German pilots, about mercy in war, stories that tried to make sense of the senseless. But none of them matched what he saw in that man's eyes. It wasn't pity, it wasn't fear, it was something harder to name, maybe understanding. One winter, decades later, Eli visited a war museum in London. In a glass case behind a row of medals, he saw a photograph. A German pilot standing beside a Messerschmitt with a yellow nose. The caption read, Leutnant Friedrich Weiss, Luftwaffe Ace, 1944. Known for sparing downed or defenseless airmen. Killed in action, 1945. Eli stared at the picture for a long time. The eyes were the same. He pressed a hand to the glass. "So you didn't make it," he murmured. He thought of the salute again, not as an act of mercy, but of recognition. 2 men, both caught in the storm, seeing each other for what they really were, young, scared, human. When he left the museum, the sky was grey over the Thames, but through the clouds he could see a patch of blue, small, clear, endless. He smiled faintly the way he had as a boy on the farm, staring up from the windmill. In his old age, Eli built model planes in his workshop, B-17s, P-51s, even a Messerschmitt. His grandson once asked why he built both sides. Eli had smiled, eyes distant. Because, kid," he said, "up there, the sky doesn't take sides." When he passed away, the family found one of his models on the shelf, the B-17 and the Messerschmitt, side by side, both wings level, both facing the same horizon. And on the base, written in faded ink, were 5 simple words: "To the man who spared me." The sound of the Daimler-Benz engine was like a living thing, smooth, powerful, and deep, a heartbeat that filled the cockpit. Lieutenant Friedrich Weiss felt it through his boots, through his hands on the stick. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 sliced through the cold morning air, above the Bavarian countryside, climbing toward the sun. It was the winter of 1944, and the war had already turned against Germany. The sky that once belonged to the Luftwaffe now swarmed with American bombers, endless silver formations that darkened the clouds. Friedrich had been flying since he was 18. Now, at 24, he was one of the few left from his original squadron. He didn't think of himself as a hero, just a pilot doing what he was trained to do: intercept, attack, survive. That morning, the radio crackled with the order: Feindlicher Bomberverband nordwestlich Schweinfurt. Intercept immediately. Enemy bombers approaching Schweinfurt. He adjusted his oxygen mask, checked his ammo, and joined the others. The yellow nose of his aircraft, like the mark of his squadron, glowed in the sunlight as they climbed toward the enemy. Friedrich had always loved flying. Even as a boy, long before the war, he'd built gliders out of wood and cloth, running down the hills near Augsburg, feeling for a few seconds that he could escape the world below. But war had turned that dream into something darker. His first kill had been over the channel. He remembered the flash, the smoke, and then the parachute. A tiny white flower opening against the blue. He'd felt pride then, the kind that came with victory. But by 1944, that pride had turned to ash. He'd seen too much. Friends shot down, fire where cities once stood. The sky, once beautiful, had become a graveyard. At 22,000 feet, they spotted the formation, B-17s, dozens of them, silver and massive, each one a flying fortress. Black flak bursts peppered the air around them. The radio was alive with chatter, shouts, curses, static. Friedrich picked a target and dove. The wind screamed over the canopy as he lined up behind a bomber. He squeezed the trigger. The guns roared, tracers cutting through the thin air. His rounds tore through an engine. Smoke billowed. The bomber fell back from formation. Another fortress filled his sights. He swung under its belly and froze. Through the glass turret, he saw a face, a young man, barely more than a boy, turning his guns toward him. But the barrels didn't move. They were jammed. The boy's eyes were wide, helpless. His mouth moved. Maybe he was praying. In that instant, something broke inside Friedrich. He could have fired. It would have been easy. A short burst, and the turret would vanish. But his finger wouldn't move. He saw not an enemy, but himself. A boy who once built gliders, who once looked up at the same sky and dreamed of flying. The noise of battle faded. Time slowed. Friedrich lifted his gloved hand and touched 2 fingers to his temple, a salute, small and human, before he rolled his plane away into the clouds. He didn't tell anyone. Not his squadron, not his commanding officer. In the official logbook, that engagement didn't exist. But he thought about it every night. Weeks passed. The Allied raids grew heavier. Supplies grew thinner. The airfields were bombed again and again. Each mission, fewer men returned. By spring, Friedrich's squadron had been reduced to 4 pilots. The others were gone, shot down, missing, or dead. Sometimes he wondered if that boy from the bomber had survived. He hoped so. He didn't know why, but he did. On quiet evenings, when the sky turned orange over the ruined hangars, he'd sit on the wing of his fighter and think about that moment. He tried to make sense of it, why he hadn't fired. Duty said he should have. Training said he must. But something greater had stopped him. Maybe it was mercy. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the faint belief that even in war, humanity could still flicker for a second before the darkness took it away. In early 1945, orders came for one last defense of Berlin. Friedrich's unit, what was left of it, was sent east. The air was thick with smoke, cities burned. The sky was no longer blue, but grey, heavy with the end of everything. That morning, he climbed into his plane for the last time. He looked at the photograph taped beside his compass, his sister, Lotta, smiling beside their mother. She'd written to him months ago, "Please come home, Friedrich. The war will end soon. We just want you back." He smiled faintly and touched the picture. "I'll try," he whispered. The squadron took off under fire. Soviet planes met them head-on, the sky filled with chaos. Bullets, smoke, screams over the radio. Friedrich's Messerschmitt twisted and rolled, avoiding tracer fire. He dove through a cloud, then up again. But the enemy was everywhere. A shell struck near his wing. The plane shuddered, smoke trailing behind. He tried to pull up, but the controls were sluggish. He saw the ground rushing toward him, fields, rivers, snow. In that final instant, he thought again of the boy in the turret. That quiet moment in the sky when death had been within reach, and he had chosen not to take it. Maybe, he thought, that small choice had meant something. Maybe mercy, even once, was enough to leave a mark on the world. His last thought was simple. I hope he lived. Then the world turned white. Years later, the fields where his plane went down were covered in wildflowers. Farmers ploughed around the wreckage, and life went on. His name was written in a book of the fallen. Just another line among thousands, but somewhere across the ocean, a man in Kansas grew old under the same sky, carrying the memory of that salute like a quiet light that never went out. And though they never met again, their two stories, one of war, one of mercy, would forever share the same horizon. The war ended, but for Eli Turner, the noise never really stopped. When the ship brought him home to New York, people were cheering, waving flags, throwing confetti. Brass bands played, reporters shouted questions, girls in bright dresses kissed strangers in uniform. It was supposed to be the sound of victory. But to Eli it all felt distant, muffled, like he was still inside the plexiglass bubble of that turret. He went back to Kansas that summer, stepping off the bus in the same small town he'd left 4 years earlier. The wheat fields were golden, the air smelled of dust and rain, and his mother cried when she saw him walk up the road. His father clapped him on the shoulder, rough and proud, but said little. That was the Kansas way. Everyone asked what it was like. Over there. Eli smiled politely, said it was hard, said he was lucky. But he never mentioned the man in the yellow-nosed fighter. For the first few months he worked the land again, rising before dawn, hitching up the tractor, watching the morning fog lift off the fields. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, every rumble of the engine reminded him of bombers overhead. Every thunderclap of a summer storm sounded like flak bursting around the plane. At night, he'd wake up sweating, heart pounding, feeling the cold steel of the turret under his hands. Sometimes he'd see the Messerschmitt in his dreams, that flash of yellow, those grey eyes, the salute. He'd wake before the ending, the moment of mercy replaying endlessly. Why? He'd whisper into the dark. No answer came. He met Claire, a schoolteacher from the next town over, at a church picnic. She had kind eyes and a way of listening that made silence feel safe. They married the next year. She never pressed him about the war. But sometimes she'd find him sitting outside late at night, staring up at the stars like he was waiting for something to return from the sky. One evening, she asked gently, "You ever think about going back? To Europe, I mean." Eli shook his head. "I've had enough of Europe for a lifetime." But that wasn't quite true. He did think about going back, not to the battlefields, but to the man who had spared him, to the moment that had divided his life into two parts, before and after. Years rolled by, America changed, the old B-17s became museum pieces, new wars began, new heroes rose. Eli worked the farm, raised 2 children, and grew quieter with age. In 1963, when the wheat was high and the radio talked about men going to space, Eli got a letter from an old crewmate, Captain Riley, his pilot. It was short. "Heard you're still out in Kansas. Remember Schweinfurt? I still think about that day. Crazy how any of us made it back. Drop me a line sometime. I'm in Chicago." Eli folded the letter and stared at it for a long time. Then slowly, he sat down and wrote back. They exchanged letters for years, talking about the missions, the crew, the ones they'd lost. But Eli never mentioned the German pilot. Not once. It felt too fragile to put into words, like if he wrote it down it might lose its meaning. Then one day, something changed. In 1978, a traveling war exhibition came to Wichita, i.e. the skies of Europe, the air war in photographs. Riley called and told him to go. "You'll like it," he said. They've got one of those German planes you used to shoot at." Eli laughed softly. "Used to," he said. He went. The museum was filled with glass cases, medals, uniforms, fragments of wrecked engines. He walked past them all without much feeling until he saw a display in the corner. A yellow-nosed Messerschmitt Bf 109 restored and gleaming under the lights. He stopped cold. Beside it, a black-and-white photograph showed a young pilot, smiling faintly, hands in his pockets. The nameplate read, Lieutenant Friedrich Weiss, 1920-1945, Luftwaffe fighter ace. Known for his unusual acts of mercy toward downed Allied crews. Eli felt the air leave his lungs. The words blurred. Acts of mercy. He stepped closer until his reflection merged with the pilot's in the glass. For a moment, he saw both faces together, the boy from Kansas and the man from Germany, forever trapped in that single heartbeat between life and death. He whispered, "So it was you." That night, back in his motel room, Eli sat at the small desk and began to write a letter he knew he'd never send. To Lieutenant Weiss, "You probably don't remember my face. I was the boy in the bull turret of the B-17 you spared over Schweinfurt. I was sure that day would be my last. But you looked at me, really looked, and then you let me live. I don't know why. Maybe even you didn't know why. I've thought about you every day since. I tried to hate you, the way soldiers are supposed to hate their enemies. But I couldn't. I think I saw in your eyes what I wanted to believe still existed in the world, decency. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's the only one that fits. If it means anything, you saved more than one life that day. You gave me a reason to believe that war doesn't kill everything inside us. Wherever you are now, I hope you've found peace. Eli Turner, Kansas." He folded the paper and placed it inside his Bible between the pages of Psalms. It stayed there for the rest of his life. In the years that followed, Eli began to talk more, at the local school, at the Veterans Hall. Not about battles or victories, but about choices. He'd tell the children, war is full of orders, but mercy's the only thing that comes from your own heart. And when people asked what kept him alive, he'd smile faintly and say, "A German pilot who forgot to hate me." By the time he grew old, his hair silver and his hands rough with years of farming, the nightmares had softened. The flak bursts became thunder again, the roar of engines became the sound of rain on the roof. He never went back to Europe, but every spring when the wheat turned gold under the open Kansas sky, he'd look up and think of the man who had spared him, and of how a single heartbeat of mercy could echo for a lifetime. The farmhouse still stood, its white paint chipped and faded, but the fields around it were golden and alive, just as they had been in Eli Turner's day. Decades had passed since the old gunner had looked up at the Kansas sky for the last time, yet somehow the land remembered him. The wheat swayed in the same soft rhythm, the same wind hummed through the windmill blades. Eli's grandson, Daniel Turner, stood on the porch one quiet afternoon, sorting through a box of old family belongings. His mother had asked him to clean out the attic after the funeral. He wasn't sure what he'd find. Maybe a few photos, some army medals, the usual relics of a man who had lived a long, ordinary life. But among the yellowed papers and model airplane parts, Daniel found something unexpected. A folded letter tucked inside an old Bible. The handwriting was neat, careful, and fading with age. The first line made him stop breathing. To Lieutenant Weiss, he read the letter once, then again. When he reached the end, "You gave me a reason to believe that war doesn't kill everything inside us." He felt something shift inside him. His grandfather, the quiet man who rarely spoke of the war, had carried this story in silence for half a century. And now it was Daniel's turn to understand it. Daniel was 27, a history teacher at the local high school. He'd grown up hearing bits and pieces about World War II, the missions, the medals, the flying fortress his grandfather had served on. But never this. Never the German pilot. He sat there for a long time, the house creaking softly around him, the letter trembling in his hands. A name, a place, a moment of mercy. He felt an urge, not curiosity, exactly, but something deeper. A sense that this unfinished story needed to be completed. That night, under the dim light of his laptop, he began searching. The internet was a vast maze of history and memory. He typed Lieutenant Friedrich Weiss, Luftwaffe, pilot, Schweinfurt, 1944. Hundreds of results appeared, mostly archive sites, war memorials, scattered photographs. But one link stood out, Bundesarchiv Records, Jagdgeschwader 27, 1944-1945. Daniel clicked. Among the scanned documents was a list of pilots. Weiss's name was there, marked KIA, April 1945, near the Oder River. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. So it was true. The man who had spared his grandfather had died just months before the war ended. Still, Daniel couldn't stop there. He dug deeper, reading articles, forum posts, even German-language sites. Finally, he found a small note in a digital archive of a Bavarian newspaper. Local family seeks to restore the grave of WWII pilot Friedrich Weiss, buried near Augsburg, survived by sister Lotte Weiss-Schneider. A sister. She would be in her 80s if she was still alive. Daniel sat back, staring at the glowing screen. The thought felt impossible, that someone still living might hold the other half of his grandfather's story. He whispered into the quiet room, "Maybe it's time to finish what he started." 2 months later, Daniel stood in a small cemetery outside Augsburg, Germany. The trip had taken all his savings, but he hadn't hesitated. Something about the journey felt necessary, not just for history, but for peace. He carried the old letter, still folded in its brittle envelope, tucked safely in his jacket pocket. The caretaker led him down a narrow path to a modest headstone under a linden tree. The stone read, Leutnant Friedrich Weiss, 1920-1945, Flieger, Bruder, Sohn, pilot, brother, son. Daniel stood there for a long while, the wind whispering through the grass. He placed his hand on the stone and said softly, "He remembered you. Every day." A voice behind him startled him slightly. "You knew my uncle?" He turned. A woman stood there, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, holding a walking cane. She wore a wool coat and a curious expression. "Lotte Weiss?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, I take care of his grave. You are—" Daniel hesitated, then offered the letter. "My name is Daniel Turner. My grandfather was Eli Turner, a B-17 ball turret gunner. Your brother spared his life." She took the letter carefully, as though it was something sacred. Her eyes scanned the lines, her lips parting in surprise, then trembling into a faint smile. "I always wondered," she whispered. "He wrote once, saying he could not keep killing. He said there was one boy, one moment, that made him believe he could still be human. He never told us more." Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. That boy was my grandfather. They stood in silence, two families, two sides of a war long gone, connected by a single act of mercy. Lotte invited him to her home that evening. It was a small cottage filled with photographs and old books. On the mantel stood a framed picture of Friedrich in uniform, smiling shyly. She poured tea and asked about Kansas, about the farm, about the kind of man Eli had become. "He never spoke of hatred," Daniel said. "He just wondered why your brother spared him." He said that moment changed everything. Lotta's eyes glistened. "My brother was not made for war. He loved flying, but he hated killing. He once said, 'In the sky there should be no enemies, only souls passing through clouds.'" She handed Daniel a small wooden box. Inside were a few medals, a photograph, and a silver pilot's badge. "He would have wanted you to have this," she said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "I can't." But she insisted. "You can, because mercy belongs to both of you." Before leaving, Daniel visited the grave once more. He placed a handful of Kansas wheat, dried and golden, at the base of the stone. Then, kneeling in the cool grass, he whispered, "You saved him. And because of that I exist. Thank you." As he stood, the evening sun broke through the clouds, casting long beams of light across the cemetery. For a moment, the sky glowed the same pale gold as home, and Daniel understood. Mercy doesn't end with the people who give or receive it. It travels on, generation to generation, like sunlight across an endless sky. That night, from his hotel window, he watched a jet carve a white contrail over the darkening horizon. He smiled faintly, just as his grandfather once had. "The sky doesn't take sides," he murmured. The Kansas sky looked the same as it always had, wide, endless, and impossibly blue. But when Daniel Turner returned from Germany, it felt different. Not smaller, not larger, just deeper. Like he could finally see everything his grandfather had seen in it, the beauty, the terror, the mercy. He stood by the old windmill that still leaned slightly toward the west, the same spot where Eli Turner had once climbed as a boy to watch the clouds drift by. The wheat around him rippled like a golden sea. In his hand was the small wooden box Lotte Weiss had given him. Inside, the Luftwaffe badge, the photo, and the letter that had connected two men across a lifetime. He had spent the flight home reading that letter again and again, each word heavier than the last. It wasn't just a letter from one soldier to another. It was a message about what survives war, not victory, not hate, but humanity. And Daniel knew then that he couldn't let it stay hidden any longer. The next week, he brought the letter to the high school where he taught history. His students, restless, phone-obsessed teenagers, had always seen World War II as something distant, black and white, a thing in textbooks. But that day, Daniel didn't teach from the book. He held up the letter instead. "This," he said quietly, "is my grandfather's story." The room fell silent. He told them about Eli Turner, the farm boy who looked at the Kansas sky and dreamed of flying, who ended up in a glass turret under a B-17. He told them about the raid over Schweinfurt, the jammed guns, the moment when death stared him in the face, and mercy looked back. He read the words aloud. "You gave me a reason to believe that war doesn't kill everything inside us." When he finished, the room was still. One of the students, quiet girl in the back, raised her hand and said, "So, they were enemies, but they saw each other as people?" Daniel nodded. "Exactly." She frowned, thinking. "Then maybe peace doesn't start with big speeches or governments. Maybe it starts with one person choosing not to hate." Daniel smiled. "That's what my grandfather believed." And in that moment he realized that the story wasn't just about the past. It was a guide for the present. Over the months that followed, Daniel began collecting the fragments of the story into a small documentary project. He recorded interviews with veterans, scanned photos, and even traveled to airfields that still held the rusted shells of B-17s. He called it The Sky Remembered. When the film premiered at the local community center, the crowd filled every seat. Old men in caps, children holding their grandparents' hands, farmers still wearing dust from the fields, all gathered under the flicker of the projector light. On the screen, Daniel E.'s voice narrated the story of Eli and Friedrich. Two young men on opposite sides of the same war, bound forever by a single decision in the sky. The audience watched the moment of mercy unfold. The jammed guns, the German pilot's salute, the silence that followed. Then came the closing scene. Daniel standing beside Friedrich's grave in Germany, placing the handful of Kansas wheat at its base. The room was silent when the credits rolled. And then, applause. Not the loud kind, but the slow, heartfelt kind that carries gratitude in every clap. Afterward, people came up to him. Strangers, veterans, teachers, even teenagers, each saying the same thing in different words. I never thought of the enemy like that. My father flew in those bombers. My grandfather fought for Germany. He said not everyone wanted to kill. Daniel realized then that the story had done what history books rarely could. It made people feel the truth. One old man, a retired airman, shook Daniel's hand with tears in his eyes. Your grandfather's story. That was mercy in its purest form. I wish we'd all had more of that back then. A few months later, a letter arrived in Daniel's mailbox. The envelope stamped from Augsburg, Germany. It was from Lotte Weiss's granddaughter. Dear Mr. Turner, my grandmother passed away peacefully last week. Before she died, she asked me to thank you and to tell you she felt her brother, Estori, had finally come home. She said now he can rest. She left you something, a line she often repeated from his old journal. I've translated it for you. The sky belongs to no nation. It remembers all who dared to fly and forgives all who learned too late that mercy is the only victory worth having. Daniel read that line over and over. The sky remembers. That summer he returned once more to his grandfather's grave, a simple stone under an oak tree on the edge of the farm. He brought two things, the letter Eli had written to Weiss and the photograph of Friedrich that Lotte had given him. He set them side by side, tucked under the grass. Then he looked up. The same endless Kansas blue above him, dotted with soft clouds drifting like ghosts of the past. Grandpa, he said quietly, I found him. I found the man who spared you. The wind rustled through the wheat, gentle and steady, as if the earth itself was answering. Daniel smiled faintly. You were right, he whispered. The sky doesn't take sides. That night, he sat on the porch with his laptop, uploading the film online. He added a short note at the end of the description, dedicated to Staff Sergeant Eli Turner and Lieutenant Friedrich Weiss, two men who met in war and taught us all what peace means. Within days, the story began spreading. Veterans shared it, teachers used it, journalists wrote about it. People from all over the world commented with their own stories of mercy, forgiveness, and humanity in dark times. And somewhere, high above it all, the sky stretched on, vast and silent, holding every memory, every act of kindness that ever dared to rise through its storms. In 1944, a German pilot chose not to pull the trigger. In 1945, he died. In Kansas, the man he spared lived, raised a family, and passed on a quiet truth. In 2025, that truth finally reached the world. The sky had remembered, and through it so did we.